Hi everybody, in this video we're going to talk about the differences between a food intolerance, a food sensitivity, and a food allergy. And you might already be wondering, why do I need to know this, lady? Because this will dictate the likelihood that you will be able to successfully reintroduce these foods over time. You're going to be much more likely to successfully reintroduce a food that you're simply intolerant to, as opposed to a food that you have a sensitivity or an allergy to. So let's get started talking about the differences, the similarities, the symptoms, and what you could do about each one of these. Let's start with the allergies and sensitivities, since I think that is what more people are familiar with, and certainly the mechanism of how that happens. So in both a sensitivity and an allergy, your immune system will see something from the gut or from the mouth and acknowledge. Let's start with sensitivities and allergies, since that's what most people are most familiar with, or at least the mechanism of how they happen, most people already kind of get. So with a food sensitivity and an allergy, these are both going to be mediated by the immune system or controlled by the immune system. So in this case, you would eat something that you are allergic to. I'll give this one an A and this one a S for sensitivity. So in the case of food allergy, you're going to eat something and immune cells in and around your mouth or your lips or your tongue or down the esophagus or even further down into the stomach will see a food particle, say peanuts, and acknowledge that and say, hey, that looks like the enemy, we need to attack it. And it will. It'll attack that using IgE antibodies. And it will spew these out along with histamine and other inflammatory stuff, and you get the typical throat closing, puffy lips, puffy everything, and you get that allergic response. IgE and this type of immune reaction is typically very quick and will happen just like that, within seconds or minutes typically. A sensitivity is a very similar phenomenon where the immune system sees an antigen, a fragment of a food. It will see that food, acknowledge, and say, hey, I think that's the enemy. Let's take gluten as an example in non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It'll say, hey, I think that gluten is the enemy. Let's attack it. But this will typically take a little bit longer. It will tend to manifest in the intestines as opposed to the mouth and the throat. And this time it will make IgG antibodies most typically. There are other types of antibodies that can be produced, but typically we think more about IgG in this case. And it's the same kind of mechanism, it's just that IgG takes a lot longer to cook up, and the immune cells that do most of the reacting tend to live in the intestines as opposed to the upper GI tract and in the respiratory tract. And the symptoms tend to be much less severe. So whereas a food allergy, I think if everybody here had a food allergy, you would probably know about it by now. But with food sensitivities, because of this immune link, because the immune system is directly linked to this and producing the IgG, symptoms of this can be inflammation for one, and I'll just put an I because I'm too lazy to draw it out, but inflammation just broadly. So sometimes people will have a food sensitivity reaction and they will have musculoskeletal pain. Like I had low back pain from mine, always the same joint, always the same location, always the same kind of pain. Some people have more of like muscle pains, like fibromyalgia. Some people get a lot of brain fog and like inflammatory brain type of stuff that happens. Some people get depression. I had one patient in the last couple of months, gosh, I think she rated her depression on like an 8 out of 10, I want to say, even with SSRIs. And she cut out gluten. And she's not a celiac, but she cut out gluten, and her depression, last time I spoke with her, she said was non-existent, and she's been successfully weaning off her SSRI with the help of her prescriber. So some people get more of the inflammation of the brain, some people get inflammation of the joints or the muscles, and some people get more of a direct inflammatory insult to their intestines. But either way, this typically goes with some sort of inflammatory stuff or, and this can go hand in hand, autoimmune disease. So for example, if you have rheumatoid arthritis and you have a food sensitivity and you ingest that food accidentally or intentionally, it will tend to perturb or exacerbate the rheumatoid arthritis. My mom has RA, and this is one of the things with her. She has Hashimoto's, and she can't necessarily tell the difference when her thyroid is being attacked versus when it's not. That change happens more gradually over time, but her rheumatoid arthritis will flare. And she knows automatically when she got exposed to gluten at a work function or a buffet or a restaurant, because that same knuckle will start to hurt and it's very, very stiff. So any sort of autoimmunity like psoriasis or musculoskeletal pain or arthritis, something that has symptoms that are overt and very easily distinguishable, is much more helpful and can probably be directly linked to this. Hashimoto's and adrenal fatigue and some of the other types of autoimmunity it's harder to discern the symptoms and the flares because it tends to just be like a crappy baseline over time, and you don't always feel the highs and lows with something like autoimmune thyroid disease, but it can happen. But I would say that for this, the symptoms tend to be inflammatory in nature or autoimmune flaring in nature, versus an allergy tends to be more of what we associate with histamine and that type of allergic response, where things get swollen, things get puffy, things get red, and things get itchy. So that is more along the lines of allergies. Now, it's worth noting before we move on also, I have had people who have diagnosable IgE antibodies that I measure in blood, and they don't have these symptoms. And we have yet to really figure out why that is. If it's more happening down in the intestines and it's not eliciting the same response. These are typically patients of mine, so this would be like people with IBS or SIBO or gastritis or some combination. So they have GI symptoms and we speculate that it's related, but I have had several patients now where I measure total IgE, it is elevated. My first go-to is to check either for mold or for food allergies, and it comes back that they have food allergies. So some of these can be more subtle or elude you up until this point, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to say that if you have an overt food allergy, you probably already know about it. Now, this is in contrast with food intolerances, which have almost nothing to do with the immune system. And I'm going to put this asterisk there, almost nothing, because the reality is that food intolerances are very inflammatory. And if you're having an inflammatory reaction, automatically that involves the immune system. But as far as the direct mechanism for why you have a food intolerance and the actual, mechanism that is at play, we're talking less about the immune system, and now we're talking about other things, namely two things. With food intolerances, it's going to be either a situation where you and your own juices are the culprit, or the bugs that you're carting around on a day-to-day basis are the culprit. An example that I see quite a lot having to do with digestive juices is a lot of people come to my office and I have them do a really thorough intake history, and there's questions where I'll ask, do you have a difficult time digesting meat? When you eat meat, does it feel like it sits in your stomach for a really long time and it's really difficult, or does it make you burp a lot? Do you have excessive burping? Do you have reflux and indigestion? And those are all starting to gather information about the likelihood that they have inadequate or low stomach acid. Now, I've got other videos on this, so I'm not going to go into detail on this topic right now, but low stomach acid will make it really hard for you to digest protein in addition to carbohydrates and fat. So that is more of an issue where your juices are to blame. You could probably tolerate meat if you were to just add in some HCl and boost your own HCl production in that case. Another really great example is lactose intolerance. That's why they call it lactose intolerance and not lactose sensitivity. In that case, and particularly this could be genetically mediated. For white people like me, this is less likely, but if you are literally any other ethnicity, there is a high likelihood that you could have at least mild lactose intolerance. Because genetically speaking, a lot of people in the world stop making the enzyme, the juice, lactase. And that is the enzyme that breaks that sugar bond in lactose and makes it digestible for you. If you don't have that enzyme to break it apart, if you don't have that juice to break that apart, you're not going to digest the sugar, and then it gets down to the lower parts of your intestines and causes the flatulence and diarrhea and bloating and symptoms of lactose intolerance. But that's another great example of it's not necessarily that your immune system is attacking lactose, and it's not that your bugs intrinsically are going after lactose, although that is a downstream effect. The inherent problem is that you don't have enough digestive capacity to digest that food. Another one that actually is more similar than you would think is histamine intolerance. Intolerance to dietary histamine very frequently is related to the juices. There is, let's see. So if you imagine your gut lining, right? So here's some of the cells that make up the epithelial lining of your gut. And the inside of your gut is up here. And then there's a membrane and, bloodstream. The rest of your body's right here. I'm going to get out of the way. So if you imagine, here's some of the cells of your small intestine. These cells can make enzymes in and of themselves, and they don't get talked about a whole heck of a lot. They're called brush border enzymes, and that does include lactase, FYI. But these brush border enzymes, if you have leaky gut or inflammation or SIBO or a lot of these conditions that I talk about on this channel, your leaky gut will mean that you don't have the capacity to make nearly as much of this brush border enzyme juice. And that will impact your ability to digest stuff. Not only does that include lactose, but also histamine. The diamine oxidase enzyme that is needed to break down dietary histamine that comes in through your food is found at the brush border, and its production is going to be impaired if you have a leaky gut. So you can largely treat histamine intolerance by working on the gut microbiome and working on the leaky gut and healing that up and getting your production back up so that you can actually make diamine oxidase again. But that is why it's called histamine intolerance and not histamine sensitivity or a histamine allergy. They're different things. It means that you don't have the juice. Now, the thing about histamine that I do feel the need to mention, because I work with this an awful lot, is if you have histamine intolerance and you don't have the enzyme, more of the histamine is going to get through and get a free pass into your bloodstream and into your body. And then that, in and of itself, will trickle over, and now you have an immune response because the immune system sees histamine and thinks, oh, I need to do something. Oh, I need to listen to that histamine signal. So that is one of the ways that the two can be very much linked, is either directly because you're absorbing more histamine than you otherwise might, or an indirect link where you don't have enough juices or you have SIBO, you eat some FODMAPs and you get a lot of bloating and you have inflammation and maybe some endotoxemia. And then that causes so much inflammation that now you instigate an immune response, but it's not precisely related to the food intolerance itself. Do you see how we have a direct immune mechanism versus an indirect immune mechanism? And of course, here's the question: what do you do about it, and what is the likelihood you can reintroduce these foods? Here's what I would say, and we'll start from the beginning again. With food allergies, I really don't recommend mucking with this unless you have the help of a trained medical professional. And I mean MD or DO. I would not work with a chiropractor on this. And I say this as a chiropractor. I would not work with an acupuncturist on this or a naturopath. I would go the medical route and probably be supervised in a hospital. So this is the sort of stuff that you can talk about with an allergist or a trained MD who's versed in this world. Now, you could do things like treat SIBO, treat dysbiosis, make sure your digestion capacity is good, modulate your immune system. You could do all of that prep work and the homework naturally leading up to that. But the day that you decide that you're going to try to eat a damn peanut again, do not do that unsupervised at home. You have to be in a hospital. You have to be under the supervision of medical professionals. I'm sorry, I know this is not very crunchy hippy-dippy of me, but that is just the way I feel. And FYI, I am totally not recommending you reintroduce allergies, again, without supervision. But that is how I would choose to go about it. For sensitivity, the likelihood of you dying because you ingested some gluten and you flared up your rheumatoid arthritis is very low. But there are consequences, and this is where sensitivities are kind of that middle ground. Everybody on this channel knows by this point that if you treat the immune system and treat the gut and manage the dysbiosis and manage the SIBO and get the digestive juices going and yada, 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 that you can treat the autoimmunity, get it into remission, pacify the immune system, and you can successfully reintroduce foods. That is true. That takes a lot of legwork though. If you're a person who just went gluten-free or casein-free in the span of 6 months ago and you're thinking about reintroducing it already and you have autoimmunity, I think that's a very bad idea. For me, the first time I tried to reintroduce sesame, for example, after I got that figured out and I knew that that was a trigger for my autoimmunity, I waited a good 5 or 6 years before I even tried. And even then, I was a little bit apprehensive. So I would say that yes, it is possible to reintroduce these foods if you have a sensitivity to them. But I would base it, I would wait quite a long time to do so, years preferably. Number 2, I would wait until your autoimmunity is in remission and very calm and controlled and that you know how to manage it properly. And also, I would pick the foods that are less likely to perturb a reaction. So for example, sometimes people get these big IgG panels done and they get these massive lists and they have 30 foods that they're supposedly sensitive to. I would start with the things that seem less likely. Like if you had a reaction supposedly to blueberries, I would pick that first. And you could do that closer. You don't have to wait 5 years to introduce blueberries. But if you had a reaction to gluten, casein, or corn, or even eggs, I would round out the top 4 with eggs. I would wait probably years before you try to reintroduce those. And I would get your autoimmunity really well under control before you start dipping your toe into that water again, because it can be dangerous. Now for food sensitivities, it's not as dangerous of a prospect to go after a food sensitivity and try to reintroduce that, as opposed to a food allergy, which can be very dangerous to do. And it's not as easy as introducing something that you're intolerant to. So here's my best recommendation for you if you have known food sensitivities. First and foremost, base it off of your autoimmunity to a large degree. If you have diagnosed autoimmunity, here's what I mean. A, I would wait until your autoimmunity is very well managed, very pacified, and in remission. That means no detectable antibodies and no major flares in the span of the last year or two. That is your safest bet. The other thing too is that you can choose based on the type of autoimmunity you have and the willingness you have to gamble with it. Here's what I mean. If you have, for example, multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease that affects the brain, I would not try to introduce anything. Because if you mess up, if you introduce something and it still ticks off your body, guess what tissue is going to be attacked? Your brain. And that's a very, very, very big deal. So for me, something that affects your brain, I would not mess with. Or something that affects your nervous system, I wouldn't mess with. Now, and I'm going to get flack for this, I know it, if you have Hashimoto's, that might be one where I'm a little bit more okay with poking the bear just to see if you can tolerate some new foods. Again, after it's fully in remission, you haven't had flares in a year, you haven't adjusted your thyroid meds. But here's my rationale with that. It's not that I'm saying that Hashimoto's is not serious, and I work with Hashimoto's patients all the time. But if you destroy a little bit more thyroid tissue, and that's the only thing that you're really worried about, worst case scenario, absolute, is that you take more of your thyroid hormone. And that's not the worst situation to be in. Versus if you have MS and you tick it off and you flare up your brain and you flame out your brain, you're going to lose neurons that you will never, ever, ever get back. And there is no drug, no medication that you can take to regrow your neurons and your myelin sheath. That just doesn't exist. So you could base it, again, like maybe rheumatoid arthritis would be somewhere in the middle. Maybe scleroderma is somewhere in the middle. You could base it off of the severity of your autoimmune disease and what tissue you would be destroying if you were to have a worst case scenario happen and you were to flare up your autoimmunity. So those are the two things, is I would wait a good long while until your autoimmunity is fully in remission. And I would also just use your noodle and figure out, do I have an autoimmunity that is worth messing with? Do I feel comfortable poking the bear? Or should I just leave it be and just be really happy that my autoimmunity is in remission? And that is a decision that only you can make. Now for food intolerances, this is a much different scenario. You could introduce these foods quickly within the next couple of weeks or months, if not sooner. So the two big things, if you couldn't already figure out, is that you need to work on the ecosystem, the bugs, the bacteria. So that means if you have dysbiosis, treat that. Whether that be an overgrowth of candida, an insufficiency or a lack of good bacteria, whatever your flavor might be, treat your dysbiosis. And I know that's easier said than done. And if you have SIBO, treat the SIBO. I have gazillions of videos on that by now. So largely you're going to come down to treating the bugs to the best of your ability. And if you can bolster your production of juices, if you can make more stomach acid or more bile or take some from an exogenous pill or do something that favors your own ability to heal the gut lining so that you have those smaller enzymes at the brush border and stimulate your digestive juices and your digestive system as a whole using herbs and lifestyle changes, those would address this piece of the puzzle. But once you get at least some of the headway made with this scenario, once you start working on the bugs or you start working on the SIBO and you start bolstering the digestive capacity and the digestive juices, you can start to reintroduce foods much sooner than you probably realize. And particularly with FODMAPs, I've seen this again and again. If you just treat the darn SIBO and the dysmotility and the juices, you can tolerate FODMAPs marvelously. I think that all human beings should be able to tolerate onion and garlic and apples and avocado with abandon. And you should be able to eat boatloads of these foods for the rest of your life. You just have to get a couple of your ducks in a row first. Okay, executive summary time. I know this was a lot to cover, but I really, really hope it was valuable to you. So the takeaway is going to be, allergies are serious. Don't mess with them without trained supervision, preferably from an MD or a DO. But on rare occasion, people do outgrow their allergies. For food sensitivities, also approach with caution, particularly if you have autoimmunity. And this needs to be a personal decision. You only will know when your autoimmunity is fully under wraps and when you're brave enough to reintroduce a food and what type of autoimmune disease you have and if it's worth even trying to poke the bear or leaving it completely alone. For those of you who have food intolerances, there is a whole world of hope, particularly people who have intolerances to FODMAPs or carbohydrates or histamine. I think that those have a lot of promise. For those with lactose intolerance, I would say that there's hope, but in the sense that there is a over-the-counter, easily acquired enzyme that you can purchase and you can enjoy dairy in moderation using that. But as far as like regrowing some of the lactase enzyme and healing the brush border, I don't know if that's necessarily possible. So don't hold your breath on lactose intolerance, particularly if you are of African descent, Asian descent, or Latino descent. But you never know, it could happen. But those of you who have the FODMAP intolerance or the carbohydrate intolerance or even histamine intolerance, there's a lot of hope. You can get off of these restricted diets and you can introduce those foods if you just work on the mechanism by which you became intolerant. If you have dysbiosis, treat that. If you have sucky digestive juices and you're always in a rush and you're always just shoving food in your face on the run, treat that. Look at this through a holistic lens, get your body in order, get your ducks in a row, and I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised to find how many foods you can tolerate. And of course, if you just watched this whole video and you're feeling totally overwhelmed and like, oh my God, what do I do now? I don't know how to move forward. I've got great news. I've got 2 other ways that I can help you beyond just YouTube videos. So first and foremost, I do appointments over the phone and Skype with people who are not in the state of North Carolina. I don't know why I didn't start mentioning that until recent videos. But if you want to learn more about working with me on a one-on-one fashion, go ahead and click the link in the doobly-doo below. It should be infinityholistichealth.com/appointments. So check that out, poke around my website and see if working together might be a good fit for you. The other thing is, particularly if you have a food intolerance and if you're stuck on a diet like low FODMAP or SCD, or if you have to be low carb and you think it's because of your microbiome and your juices and your IBS, then you might want to check out my online course, FODMAP Freedom in 90 Days. Now, obviously, this is really geared towards people stuck on the low FODMAP diet and people with IBS, but really what this is going to entail is it's going to be an IBS and SIBO and microbiome crash course. We're going to talk about the things going on in your gut that make you intolerant to these foods that you want to eat again. So go ahead and check that out. The link is also in the doobly-doo below, and I would be honored to help you on your healing journey and help you reintroduce these yummy foods. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.